reminder, you can put it in the chat. We're just going to wait one more.
For everybody's information, we are now recording, so watch what you say.
But we're still going to wait a minute.
The warning. Watch our manners.
Watch your
So
manners.
why don't you, Linda, why don't you pause for a moment while we have a one.
He's a professor.
Well, thank you again, everyone, for coming. This is the second in global conversations on global crises, voices of the Madison Jewish community. So this is great. The first one was inaugurated by Linda, who's now our administrator, on June 24th on health policy. And tonight, Joel Peterson, our very own Joel Peterson, will be leading a discussion and reflections on climate change and its consequences. We're really fortunate to have Joel in the part of the temple. Joel is a Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor at UW-Madison. He's Professor of Environmental Chemistry and Technology in the Civil Engineering Department. And his research focuses on how we adapt to an ever-warming planet. So this is really, really timely because even in the midst of a pandemic, climate change is just continuing and the planet is just warming. So tonight I thought, tonight Joe will speak for a few minutes, tens of minutes, and then lots of questions. So please just interrupt at any time. You could raise your hand electronically, you can raise your hand physically, you can put something in the chat box. We'll be looking at all of them. And I should just say before we begin, stall one minute or more, Lester Pines will be leading the third discussion, and that will be on August 12th. As you know, Lester is an attorney and a civil rights advocate in Madison, and that will be reflections on civil liberties in times of crises, and that'll be Wednesday, August 12th, and you'll be getting information on that. So, Joel, I think we're going to turn it over to you. So thank you once again for leading this discussion tonight.
Thank you, Gil. Thanks for the introduction, and good evening, everybody. I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk about, to lead this discussion on climate change and its implications.
Joel, if you could hang on for just 1 second, could the person who just came on please identify yourself? With the numbers in there.
$608.
Yeah, 857. Yeah.
I'm going to unmute.
I can't get on my computer, so I'm doing it on my phone.
Oh, okay. It's Donald.
Donald? All righty. I'll rename him. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You're recording,
okay.
Linda, right?
Pardon me?
You're recording.
Yes.
Great.
Okay. So one may ask, why cover climate change now? Don't we have enough on our plate? Why address the topic of climate change when we're trying to cope as a country with the public health and economic consequences of a pandemic, while we're reckoning anew with racial inequities in our country? And the reason is unfolding climate change crisis is not going to wait for us. It's not going to wait for us to take care of COVID-19. It's not going to wait for us to take care of to reform society. The pieces are already in motion. The physics, chemistry, and biology, all interlinked in our climate system, appear to be indifferent to our plight with respect to the pandemic and the resolution of our social ills. So what I want to do tonight is give some background on climate change and expected implications, and then shift the discussion towards values and talk about what values we can deduce from our textual tradition, focusing primarily on the Tanakh. But to start with, I'd like to read a passage from a book by Mark Arax, who's a author and former journalist for the Los Angeles Times. The book called The Dreamt Land, Chasing Water and Dust Across California. And it's an environmental history of water in California. And the book opens in late January 2014. Mark is looking outside his window, out of his window in Fresno, California. in the Central Valley of California, one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world. And he's seeing that his apricot trees are blooming about 3 weeks early, and the flowers are a little bit too red for this stage of development. Fast forward 3 months or so, he wakes up, looks out into his small orchard and finds all of the fruit has dropped. There's piles of unripe apricots around the bases of all of his trees. So he calls his friend, a nut grower who specializes in pistachios and almonds. His name's Brad. And they drive out to Brad's farm, and I'll pick up from there, where they just come onto Brad's property. Brad jumps out of his truck, grabs a pistachio stick off the ground, and heads into his orchard. I run to catch him. He's jousting with the pistachio's gray branches, which resemble the antlers on a big buck. Unlike a walnut grove, tall and leafy and throwing out so much shade that it draws you into its tranquility, the pistachio orchard has been grooved for industry. Not a weed pokes out of a crack, not an animal scurries into a burrow. Wood and leaf follow sharp, pruned lines. The orchard has been laid out with the same exactness. For every 24 females, a single male has been planted with a pattern radius. There's no mistaking the males. Their trunks are painted rooster red. I joke to Brad that this is agriculture's version of a harem, but he is in no mood for humor as he walks from male to male, reaches back with his stick and gives a hard spank to the hanging flowers. No green-brown pollen comes off. In all my years of growing pistachios, I've never seen this happen. The females are ripe and ready, but the males are nowhere near. The whole orchard is out of sync. What do you think it is? He stares down at the toe of his boot, scuffing the dirt, and then looks up. Global warming, he says. Climate change. Brad and I have known each other since the 7th grade, and over the course of our adult lives, mine as a writer, his as a grower, he has often served as my voice of agrarian reason. He's never been afraid to take on the role of heretic, but no other big farmer I know dare speak those words out loud. You're sure? We haven't had a winter in 2 years. You need chill to make nuts. There's been no chill. So this is one manifestation of the unfolding climate change crisis. The plants, their pollinators getting out of sync. I'd like to just give a really brief primer on climate change, so around climate and climate change. So Earth's atmosphere contains gases, which we refer to as greenhouse gases, that function in the way that glass panes do on a greenhouse. They let the sun's light through, but trap a fraction of the heat radiating back out into space, and in doing so, they warm the Earth's surface. Under normal levels of greenhouse gases, the average temperature across the globe is about 59 degrees Fahrenheit. If we didn't have greenhouse gases, Earth's temperature would be about 0 degrees Fahrenheit, unsuitable for life as we know it. These greenhouse gases include carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and ozone. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the concentrations of most greenhouse gases have gone up. For example, the concentration of carbon dioxide has increased by 50% since 1870. And the increase is accelerating. We think about the total amount of carbon that humans have put into the atmosphere solely through the combustion of fossil fuels in industry. It's 425 billion tons of carbon. To put that in perspective, the Amazon rainforest contains about 76 billion tons. So humans have put the equivalent of about 5.5 Amazon rainforests worth of carbon into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. And that's not the only route by which we're adding to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Land use changes, primarily deforestation, has also resulted in the release of large amounts of carbon, 180 billion tons, not to mention eliminating the ability of forests to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So there's various lines of evidence we can look at that demonstrate that the climate is already changing. And the data I'll talk about are from NASA website. And they say on their website, the current warming trend is of particular significance because most of it is extremely likely, better than 95% probability, to be the result of human activity since the mid-1900s, and is proceeding at a rate that is unprecedented over decades and millennia. The warming that's occurring now is about 10 times faster than the warming that occurred, the average rate of warming at the end of ice ages. So some of the signals that we see that indicate that the climate is changing. We've seen a rise in global temperature so far, about 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 19th century. Much of that's within the last 35 years. The oceans are warming. We've had about a half a degree increase in temperature of the upper 700 meters since 1969. The ice sheets are shrinking. Between 1993 and 2016, Greenland has been losing 286 billion tons of ice per year, and Antarctic 127 billion tons per year. And for Antarctica, the rate has tripled in the last decade. We're seeing glaciers retreat in almost every location on Earth: the Andes, Himalayas, Rockies, Alaska, and the Alps. We're seeing decreased spring snow cover and more rapid melting of snow. The level of the seas are rising 8 inches since the last century, and the rate in the last 2 decades is nearly double that from the last century. The extent of Arctic sea ice is declining. We're seeing increases in extreme weather events. The number of high temperature events in the US has been increasing, while the number of low temperature events has been decreasing, even with the polar vortex that was experienced. There's been also an increase in the number of intense rainfall events. And finally, the oceans are acidifying. They've become more acid by about 30%. And and this is due to the absorption of carbon dioxide, which converts into carbonic acid. And the amount of carbon dioxide that the oceans are absorbing is increasing by about 2 billion tons per year. So these changes in global climate will continue throughout the century and into the next, even if we do nothing, even if we shut off our emissions. Some of the effects this will have are increases in temperature. We're on a trajectory for a 5.4 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit increase in temperature by 2100, far overshooting the target of 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit that nations have been striving to achieve. This means that the frost-free season and the growing season in the US will lengthen, and it has been since the 1980s. Precipitation patterns will change. It's hard to know exactly how, but we think that in many areas of the US, the climate will become more arid. Despite this, the frequency of intense rainfall events is expected to increase. We expect to see more droughts, more heat waves, more hurricanes. Hurricanes will become more intense, more frequent, and of longer duration. Sea level is expected to rise by 1 to 8 feet by 2100, and the Arctic is likely to become ice-free in summer by mid-century. So these changes in the physical environment are going to have dramatic impacts on human society, on the life support system for human society. These changes will result in the reconfiguration and perhaps collapse of ecosystems. We'll see a loss of biodiversity because of extinction or despeciation. Climate may change too rapidly for ecosystems to adapt. That is, trees don't move very rapidly. So if their zone of ideal climate moves further north, then they are able to reproduce, then we may have problems with forests repopulating or populating new areas. So this change in climate is going to set ecosystems on a new trajectory towards some sort of quasi steady state that we don't know exactly what that will be and will take generations to achieve. There'll be impacts on agriculture. We'll see more severe weather events damaging crops, more water scarcity, higher temperatures, changes in the growing range of crops. Some may no longer be suitable, for example, for Wisconsin, and others will become suitable for Wisconsin. We'll see changes in the range of insect pests and crop diseases. As the book passage indicated, we'll see, we're already seeing asynchrony in between flowering and pollination. And all these impacts in agriculture will affect prices, nutrition, and the availability of food. I expect that we will see wars over water. We'll see flooding of coastal areas. This will cause the inundation of agricultural lands such as rice paddies, seawater intrusion into groundwater, making the groundwater less usable, and displacement of human populations. It's expected that by 2050, about 15 million people in Bangladesh will be displaced because of rising sea levels. I think we'll see large-scale migrations of people due to water scarcity, food scarcity, and disease and wars. On the public health front, we'll see the change in the geographical range of vectors of human diseases and more death due to heat stress. And with the increase in severe weather, we will, rather severe weather events, will see damage to infrastructure with the associated economic consequences. So there's a lot we could talk about. There's a lot of ethical issues at many levels in causes and adaptation, mitigation of climate change. I thought for this initial discussion on this topic that we could focus on its root, really, the relationship of humans to the environment. Or if we put it maybe more biblically, between the bearers of the divine image and the divine creation. And so this evening, I'm going to focus on the Tanakh as a primary source and lead us in thinking about what values, what principles we can educe from the text. So the passages I'll be reading from Robert Alter's translation, and I'd like to start with a passage that is often cited in the context of the of climate change and other environmental issues, and that's Genesis 1:28. So after God creates man and woman in his image, it says, and God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and conquer it and hold sway over the fish of the sea and the fowl of the heavens and every beast that crawls upon the earth. So a question for us to discuss a little later. Is this commission a license for ecological irresponsibility? Is the only value that nature has is for man's use? Such an accusation has been leveled against the Tanakh by many environmentalists, including ones as prominent as Aldo Leopold. I have to say that these criticisms are often focused solely on this and a couple of other verses and ignore the rest of Tanakh. And for purposes of ease of discussion, I'll call this the despot model, where humans can have a despotic rule over nature. Aldo Leopold and others have advocated for a different model of human relationship with the environment, and that's what is often referred to as a stewardship model. And this focuses on responsible use and the protection of the natural environment through conservation and sustainable practices. And there are passages within the Tanakh, within the Torah, that people may cite to support this view. And one example is in the second creation account, after God forms humans from humus, from the soil, and blew into their nostrils the breath of life, and human became a living creature. God placed humans in the Garden of Eden and set him down there in order to till it and to watch it. So perhaps a more benign interaction with nature than subduing and holding dominion over it. So this leads to the question, what is the position of the Tanakh on human relationship to the environment? Is it this despot model? Is it the stewardship model? Or is it something else? I think we need to be thoughtful and consider the environmental attitudes that are reflected in the Tanakh within their context, to try to understand the attitudes through their own ancient perspectives. I think that's a useful place to begin. Maybe it's not where we're going to end not where we should end, but where we can begin. If we don't do this, we run the risk of superimposing our own biases onto the text as we read it through modern environmentalist lenses. So we don't have a time this evening for a comprehensive treatment, so I'm just going to highlight a few areas. So start in Genesis with the creation of the earth and all that lives in it. As a starting point for the narrative arc of Tanakh. We start with creation, we start with Eden. Adam and Eve have been created, they're in the garden, they're naked and unashamed, they're living in harmony with creation. This is a sort of ideal state. But then we have the whole narrative of the Tanakh until we get to the Messianic era, where we return to an ideal state, maybe slightly different. But there again, we have, in addition to beating swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks, we have passages in Isaiah about the preternaturally harmonious coexistence between predators and prey, the wolf lying down with the lamb, the leopard lying down with the kid, the calf and the lion feeding together. Apparently, carnivory has been abolished. And in Hosea, that prophet talks about God establishing a covenant with the animals at that stage in the overall arc of history. The animals will no longer fear destruction, and they'll live at peace with humans. Another aspect, and maybe one that's a little uncomfortable to our modern sensibilities, is the Tanakh often views nature as cooperating with God in blessing or punishing Israel. So as one example, in Deuteronomy 11, this is a familiar passage. It shall be, if you indeed heed my commandments, which I charge you today, to love the Lord your God and worship him with all your heart and all your being, I will give the rain of your land in its season, early rains and late, and you shall gather your grain and your wine and your oil, and I will give grass in your field to your beasts, and you shall eat and be satisfied. And if Israel worships other gods, the Lord's wrath will flare against you, and he will hold back the heavens, and there will be no rain, and the soil will not give its yield, and you will perish swiftly from the goodly land that the Lord is about to give you. And there's other examples. So in this belief system, it's postulated that there are environmental repercussions for an entire range of human action, some of which we wouldn't currently think of leading to environmental consequences. Another aspect is there are principles within the Tanakh that seem to suggest ecological restraint or restraint in dealing with the environment. And some examples are the Torah's insistence that God owns the land in Leviticus, in the passage talking about Shemitah in the year of Jubilee. Humans are said to live on the land only as strangers and as sojourners with God. Familiar passage about the prohibition against wanton destruction, specifically the felling of fruit trees during a siege. From this passage, there's been rabbinic extensions to not cutting off the water supply to trees, not overgrazing the countryside, prohibition for the unjustified killing of animals, prohibition of polluting water and air, and to wasting resources. And then passages such as Deuteronomy 22:6 that forbids killing a mother bird along with her young has been used to educe principles of prohibitions against inhumane treatment of animals. So just a couple of other aspects I'd like to mention before we can open it to discussion. There's other passages, especially in the Psalms, where we find nature praising God, and nature being a manifestation of God's glory. And especially impressive and beautiful example is God's response to Job speaking out of the whirlwind. And God challenges Job with a series of questions about Job's understanding of the natural world. So I'll just read a little bit of this. Have you ever commanded the morning, appointed the dawn to its place? By what way does the west wind fan out, the east wind whip over the earth? Who split the channel for the torrent and a way for the thunderstorm? To rain on a land without a man, wilderness of bare of humankind, to sate the desolate dunes and to make the grass sprout there. This is a long passage. It goes on for 4 chapters, but it shows that God is concerned with nature outside of man's realm, outside of man's domain. And nature appears to have a value independent of human utility. So does the Tanakh align with the stewardship model or the despot model, or is it something else altogether? In my view, I disagree that the Tanakh is ecologically arrogant. It condemns ruthless despoilation of nature or choices of death over life for humanity, earth, and its creatures. It upholds an ideal with a restored nature, with humans and animals dwelling in peace, and puts restrictions on our actions with regard to the environment. So I think, although maybe we don't share the same worldview as those that wrote the Tanakh, an environmentalism with roots in the Tanakh and other texts in our tradition can discourage, for example, the coveting of one's neighbor's property and exploiting the poor as stepping stones toward wealth and power. Greed is widely acknowledged as one of the main roots of the current environmental crises. Biblical poetry can encourage us to see in nature other living spirits that have value independent of how they benefit us. The Tanakh shows a belief that an entire range of human activities can impact the environment, have environmental repercussions. And perhaps these can be add new dimensions to the conversations about the environment. So I'll end by saying, I think we've, I think we've fulfilled the commandments to fill the earth, to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Whether the passage was meant in a utilitarian manner, meaning or not, we do have dominion over the earth. Our actions are affecting the earth globally. And so we're in the place where the future of the divine creation and the survival of the image of God has been placed in our hands. So I'll end there and we can discuss.
Oh, Joel, that was beautiful. Thank you very much. So there's lots of time for discussion. You can raise your hand physically or electronically or in the chat box. So maybe I can start, Joel. Do you think that the later writers in the Sanhedrin or later, do you know of any that actually sort of confronted the issue of this dominion over the earth and whether we were exploiting the earth in our actions? When did it become sort of an explicitly a Jewish issue? And maybe you could also tie into that, like why, I guess one reason, why hasn't this become more of a Jewish issue in modern times?
Those are good questions, Gil. I don't know about the first, what in the time of the Second Temple was being talked about with regard to human dominion over nature. I know that there are things in the Talmud written about it, but and I think we would view the discussions as as having supporters on both sides of this issue in terms of human utility versus preservation of something that's important to God, but maybe not useful for us. Why has it not been a bigger issue for the Jewish community in modern times? I would say that I think a lot of Jews are quite concerned about the environment and have been contributing at different levels. I guess I think you're getting at why isn't there a concerted effort or more discussion about this?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Maybe maybe there's been more other things on the plate, I suppose. Other concerns that seem more pressing, although this one becomes more pressing each day.
Well, we have a lot of people ready to ask questions. So, Carol, why don't you go first? Carol, you're muted. You're muted. You're still muted, I think. I don't think we can unmute you. Oh. Can anyone hear Carol, or is it just me?
No.
Carol, I think you're still, maybe your volume is all the way down. You just went back to mute. Now you're on. But I think maybe your volume is all the way down. Yeah, keep going up.
Or earphone jack.
Or maybe
Yeah.
the phone jack is, oh.
How about now?
That's good. Okay, great.
That's good. All right. I want to take a more charitable view of the first mention, the so-called despot model, as Joel referred to it, where the Lord says to Adam and Eve, conquer it, referring to the earth. Well, surely the Lord understands that he's created lesser beings than himself and given them a very complex environment in which to operate. And in order for them to be successful, they're going to have to learn a lot and figure out a lot. And on that level, to conquer it. So I don't take such a dark view of that word.
I personally don't take such a dark view of it either, but I wanted to draw a sharp contrast with the stewardship model and speak about it in the way that people that speak about it in the manner that people who criticize that passage in particular with respect to environmentalism, discuss it.
I think Patty was next.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes.
I can.
Okay, good. I was going to say that part of taking over animals and stuff, we do have a very strong prohibition that's been around, Tsar Ba'alei Chaim, that you cannot cause harm to animals, and that we have to restrict our own urges in terms of we have to feed our animals first before we feed ourselves. We cannot hurt them. We can't live from living ones. We have to rescue a wounded animal. We also have Shomrei Adamah, which means that we have to be guardians or protectors. All of that's in the Talmud. And I wanted to say that underneath all of this is something that you can either take lightly or very profoundly, which is in a completely different context, which is, when does life begin? And in Nashim, in the Talmud, it tells when does life begin in terms of abortion and contraception and conception and all of that. And after a number of lists, included always in that list is that even after a baby is born and after 30 days, and all of that, it is not considered a nephesh, a full human being, until it has the ability to experience wow, which is considered appreciation of blessing. So in terms of going out and conquering the world, I don't think you can go out as Genghis Khan without and be a human being unless you're really psycho and can go wow over, mutilation. But it really requires a wow to the universe. So I think with that kind of reverence and wonder, then taking care of the universe, taking care of the world around us is really the fascinating mystery of how do we get it to work without destroying it. I mean, there is a way through this maze, and it's a puzzle to be solved. It's not just a wall that is static. So that's it.
Thanks. So in preparing for this, I was struck by discovering that in Genesis, for example, both humans and animals are said to have nephesh. And in Ecclesiastes, both humans and animals are referred to as having ruach.
Yes, and you don't get their blood. You can't have their blood. You can't eat it. Their life, which is their life.
Yep.
Wow, that's great. Hey, Art, you're up next.
Joel, first of all, thanks for a wonderful presentation and very interesting to combine all the passages in the Tanakh with climate change. I guess I had a different question that I wanted to ask you, and that is, at what point in the climate change happening are we at the point of no return? In other words, at what point do we reach when it's too late? When anything we do, it's snowballed, because it does gain a momentum, as I understand, if that's correct. And then at some point, no matter what you do, it's too late. And what can you kind of outline? That's probably a complicated question, but at what point are we there, or are we near, or where does that come, and how will we know?
Yesterday, Joe Biden said 9 years. I don't know where he got that number.
It's hard to know. What we've already done will have consequences for decades to come. The question is, at what point are we going to reach a tipping point where a question is, at what point do we reach a tipping point where the changes accelerate? And I can't really speak to that authoritatively, but I expect, because of the positive feedback loops that are built into the climate system, that we may well reach some point like that. So to answer your question, Art, I don't know when. It depends on forecasts based on modeling, when we might expect a point of no return for some outcome. But I'm not sure exactly when that will be. Maybe it's 9 years. Maybe it's less.
Steve, you're up.
Yeah. What do you think has insulated human beings from having a sense that there is some kind of divinity within the natural world around us that needs, that wow effect, or the awe in contemplating the natural world around us, that we have a sense that we want to preserve it and keep it and love it the way it is. Obviously, there's a kind of arrogance in human beings, but there's a sort of indifference to, there's an endless supply of nature out there that we can use and destroy, and we just can't comprehend the consequences. We can't see them coming. Is religion and a return to a sense of awe in relationship to the universe, is that maybe the only way in which humanity would turn around? Or is this simply a mechanism, that the natural world, that doesn't contain anything other than it's just physics and chemistry, and it's going to happen the way it happens, and there's not much of anything that humans could do? That's a lot.
Yeah, that is a lot. So I think a purely materialistic worldview, and using that to address humans' relationship with the environment will, I think, ultimately be inadequate. Because from a materialist worldview, what is good is what is successful. Being strong is successful, being weak is a failure. And we've seen where that leads in some societies in the past. I do think that a sense of awe is important. I think a lot of people have experienced that when they are out in the wilderness, if you will. In some of the things I have been reading, there is a discussion about there is a element in element in environmentalism, deep ecology, of encouragement to return to some sort of pagan understanding of nature and humans' position within it. But that also can lead to barbarism. So I think we do have something to add to the conversation. I think that we view God often as we have various views on God. So as transcendent or immanent or both, and I think approaching other forms of life, approaching nature with a degree of reverence is necessary in order for us to have the emotional commitment to preserving the environment. And it has to be emotional. It can't just be in our heads. I read a book by Jonathan Safran Foer called "We Are the Weather." And he makes an interesting point that one reason that people aren't engaging with climate change as an issue is because it has none of the elements of a good story. it doesn't have a clear protagonist, a clear villain. It doesn't have, it's moved slowly. It seems that nothing you do really matters in the face of this large scale, slow moving crisis. So that's one reason why I wanted to open with this passage from Mark Ericks's book, to maybe make it a little more concrete, that people are experiencing the results of climate change already.
Joel, Joanna wrote in the, oh, Joanna's raising her hand, so she can repeat that. Go ahead. So Joanna, you're muted. You're muted there. I can't unmute you.
Okay now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So what I wrote was, and I'll just read it, there are many plans to protect the environment. I own a 50-acre tree farm. There are governmental organizations with the specific intention of preserving the land. They have the elements which they have the easements which you can own the land and they oversee, or they take over the land to keep it vibrant. Joe Biden has offered other ways to change from fossil fuels to solar panels. So I think all of those things are positive, and hopefully, I don't know what you think, Gil, but potentially ways in which we can either, well, I don't think we'll ever stop this thing, but we can at least slow it down and move in a different direction. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, I think there are large scale structural things that we need to do, like shifting the dominant energy sources that we rely on. Certainly we need efforts at reforestation, afforestation to sequester carbon from the atmosphere and reduce CO2 concentrations. People, I think, are often frustrated that as individuals, they don't feel like there's a lot that they can do that is useful, or they do things that make them feel good that may or may not be the most effective things that an individual can do. So some of the things that have been discussed as effective actions that individuals can take are things like reducing meat consumption, reducing use of cars, reducing air travel, having fewer children, as well as energy, trying to reduce energy usage at home.
Sounds good.
Joel, I was wondering whether, how you personally combine the spiritual and the scientific, and whether or not at some point in time you sort of think to yourself, well, the world of God's punishment is upon us. I mean, it's absolutely, this fits every aspect of when you think of God punishing us for misbehavior, it seems that that's the way we see the world around us.
It is.
Was someone else going to say something?
Yeah, that it isn't. We aren't limited with that punishment. It seems to be across the board these days. That was all. Yeah.
I think personally, I have to say sometimes when you've spoken in or led the discussion in Torah study, Steve, and I go home, I'm thinking about quantum mechanics and relativity, and that's touching on spirituality in a way.
Yeah.
Or when I on sabbatical read a book about van der Waals forces, I was amazed, or I guess in awe about quantum fluctuations in empty space, things coming into and going out of existence instantaneously. Yeah. Thinking about the very fabric of reality.
Yeah.
I mean, as a environmental chemist, environmental scientist, I have a strong desire to use my professional life to help society live in a more sustainable way, to currently to adapt to the climate change that's ahead of us. In terms of the punishment, that's an interesting question. And I read the passage from Deuteronomy about blessings and punishments mediated through the environment. And, you do wonder. I did wonder when hurricanes destroyed oil rigs and the earth getting its revenge.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, but certainly there is greed at the root of a lot of our exploitation of the environment. So certainly there's.
I think Jane would like to follow up on this. Jane, go ahead.
Well, can you hear me? Am I?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, wait. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, we can hear.
Okay. Well, I was just thinking, I loved your presentation. Well, what I was thinking is that it seems like every time you take one step forward, you realize that you have to take 2 steps backward. Like, for example, my daughter was just here and we were actually talking about some of these issues. And she was telling me there's some movie about making solar panels and wind farms that she thought was amazing because they're destroying all these rainforests to make these quote unquote improvements. So I was just kind of thinking about that. And also, I always wonder about the relationship of eating meat. And I have read that that is a huge contributor to greenhouse emissions. And I was just wondering, like, how much is like raising cattle the way it's raised now a problem?
So animal agriculture is a large contributor to climate change. I talk primarily about carbon dioxide, and that's sort of the currency that people talk about in terms of carbon in the atmosphere. The cows produce a lot of methane, and methane has a global warming potential 86 times larger than carbon dioxide on a per molecule basis over a 20-year time period. So that's one thing that cattle are doing, especially, is producing a lot of methane. We grow a lot of crops for the sole purpose of raising animals for our consumption. So that's water and energy that's being embodied into the grain, soy, whatever we're feeding to the animals. A lot of the deforestation that has happened in the world, especially in South America, has been driven by the desire for more land to raise livestock. So it's hard to give a number or a percentage for how much of climate change is attributable to animal agriculture, but it's not insignificant. The reason why it's difficult is because it depends on how you account for the various inputs, as well as the loss of, say, carbon dioxide sequestration through the forests that have been cut down.
Alice, go ahead. You're muted, Alice. I can unmute you. You have to unmute.
Unmute.
Okay.
Unmute.
You're still unmuted. You're still muted, I mean.
Yeah, sure. Got it.
I did it, yeah. So I just, you just think of how the skies cleared up when COVID started and people stopped flying and factories closed down. Look at the difference that just that made. It's just amazing. I mean, the skies are clear. It's quite startling. So there are a lot of things that we can do. I mean, that's how we're going to get things done. We just have to work at them one by one.
Yeah, and hopefully some of the things that we've implemented because of COVID to get around the not traveling using air transportation. Hopefully we'll carry some of those things forward. I know Gil and I are constantly going to meetings, flying to meetings, large gatherings of people, and in some cases have been done effectively through the internet, and that has a potential for reducing carbon footprint of individuals.
Hey, Joel, I wanted to ask you a question to follow up on, I guess, motivated by a lot of the comments made tonight. If governments are slow to respond to this because of either their own inertia or their own misconceptions or drives that are different, what role do you see, or I guess for anyone, what role do you see for a unified religious response that could sort of maybe tip the balance, I guess, with Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, the whole major world religions coming together as a concerted effort to educate and persuade people of the earth to act differently? That's not part, seems to not, we haven't been successful secularly in convincing enough people. Maybe it's a matter of time, but as you've answered to Art and others, we don't have that time. So how do you see another way to harness large scale efforts?
I think there have been some efforts at maybe the very tops of religious organization level. I don't know that it's trickled down, I think you'd want both leadership in religious groups across the globe to be engaged and work towards engaging their communities. And with that, yes, I think there could be change. There could be sufficient influence placed on governments to make some changes.
Or maybe an election.
I have to, I'm going to just jump in here and say that I think that all of that is good, that religions can come together, but I think too often it's a kumbaya kind of friendship, and we'll all be friends and get to know each other, and somehow that will all get rid of racism and poverty, and maybe even find a way to overcome pandemics and stuff. And I think that we need to partnership faith communities with science. And
definitely.
Maybe make it a very strong partnership, because we've been turned away from science and turned away from fact. And it hasn't just been this administration, but I think it's been a steady turning towards faith and belief and hope in miracles, and I'll just call it kumbaya, and say that somehow we'll all just get groovy together and levitate. I don't know.
Yeah, those are good points.
Yeah.
There are a lot of religions in the world, mainly Eastern religions, but even Native American religions that tend to live a lot more comfortably in harmony with nature. I mean, that's part of their religion, actually, much more so than the Western religions, I think.
I think I'd agree with you, but I think it also bears thinking about that when the ancestors of the Native Americans came into North and South America, there were massive extinctions of large mammals because they wiped them out.
Hey, Linda had her hand up, and then Jane.
I was just thinking, it occurs to me that one of the maybe sociological things going on is that the environmental movement, the concern about the environment, seems to be pretty strong from a demographic group among relatively young kids, the high school kids, college kids. And My recollection is back when DDT was a big issue, that was also the case, that the young folks saw this as a serious problem. We're going to lose eagles and other wildlife. So I guess I wonder if there's any literature out there or people have studied, or what your thinking is about whether maybe this time the concern among the young people will find its way with them, continue with them as they proceed into their 20s, 30s, and 40s, or whether this is just the latest version of excitement when you're young and then it dissipates.
I don't know of studies that have been done on that. Perhaps there have been, but you're right. A younger generation is very concerned about the environment, in general, making generalizations. My own kids have been very concerned about the sort of future they're going to live in because of what my generation, before my generation, have done. I don't know. It's hard to say if it will persist. I think it probably will persist because the problem's not going to go away. It's only going to get more severe. I think younger people are maybe more apathetic with regard to their ability to influence politics, government than they should be, perhaps. I think they're not really looking to government as providing solutions. So there's some apathy there that I think needs to be overcome.
To some degree, I'll just say this. Some of the provider community, the business community is, right now government, a lot of folks in government are saying, I don't care, let's have jobs and let's do away with the National Environmental Policy Act. And I guess that was done in today. But some of the government groups have continued to say, even as some people in the last 3-4 years have said, let's start to dig up coal in great quantities. A lot of the utilities have been saying, we ain't going there. We don't care what the government leaders, frankly, are saying. We're not going to do that because we think the future is, whether it's solar panels or other things, we are not going to go back there because we don't think that's a very good idea. So there are people outside the governmental sphere who are taking a position that presumably environmentalists, conservationists would applaud versus, and have said, okay, you guys in government aren't just worth the effort anymore.
Yeah, well, that's good, of course, but we need the government engaged too.
Yeah, I'm not saying
not working against it.
Jane, did you have your hand up? Yeah, go ahead. Did you have to unmute?
Unmute.
Joe, I was just thinking this would make a really good sermon for our temple. So I have a suggestion that maybe you could, like not the whole thing, but I think education for all of us goes a long way. And I think your presentation was really, really good.
So how about,
I learned a lot putting it together.
So Joel, where do you think it should enter in our educational system? Do you think you see ways for it to coming into elementary school and moving its way forward, upward?
I think it ought to be. I think more broadly, I think we need to increase science literacy in the country. Not just kids learning facts, but kids learning how scientists think, or how to think like a scientist. It's not some alien way of thinking about things. It's just applying logic to problems.
Yeah.
I also, Gil, and Joel too, I mean, I constantly would worry, about high school students who don't see the stars. I mean, that was like a big, I mean, and that lack of contact with the natural world, that intimacy with the natural world, I think is an insulation against feeling that wow sense of awe, and wonderment in terms of nature. So as well as education in a formal sense into the world of science and thinking, I believe that there should also be just getting children out into the natural world as much as possible and letting them interact in that way.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Yeah. Instead of having classes last spring, we should have just gone out and stared at the stars.
Well, no, I think it does actually. I think that this rush to get everybody back in school obviously is a very dangerous thing. But there was an opportunity here, and maybe still is, to rethink what school should actually be all about. And one of the biggest problems in terms of schooling is, I think, this lack of direct knowledge of the world around us, natural world.
And I think there's a delight and wonder in solving puzzles. And in, first of all, in just seeing that there's a puzzle, and then having the optimism that it can be solved, even if you don't see the answer. And then using science and your sense of wonder and optimism to believe that somewhere, even if you don't get it, it's there. So I think you can find, you don't have to look at the stars. I mean, I think you can look in a chemist lab and see it, or look in a microscope. I mean, my God, or inside the human body is like, woo, or talk to a psychotic. I mean, it's like wonderful. What I'm serious. It's like, I have a psychotic patient who it's a wonderful language for me to try and figure out what they're experiencing and what they're feeling and what they're saying and what it all means, how to bring it from them to me. It's a foreign language, you know, and it's up to me to do the decoding, to be able to do the healing. So I think in the sense, to go back to what I said about the wow factor, is to get the wow, but to get the sense that we can solve puzzles and it doesn't have to be instantaneous. And on the absolute flip side of that is, how do we get out of this climate change mess? I don't underestimate absolute greed on the side of business, because there's money to be made in things that save our tushies. And so I think that we can, I mean, people are learning how to do things better and better and alternative ways. You know, they're coming up with ways to not have cars that smoke, you know, and gas guzzlers and stuff. So people are coming out with ways that do it better. I mean, the cruise industry is undergoing a complete catharsis, because they have a lot of navel gazing to do to figure out how the hell they're going to make things environmentally safe for us and for the world and everything else, because they're in it for the money. So you don't have to necessarily be pulled by the goodness, by the mitzvah. As long as you're in the right direction and you don't get too crazy, maybe being pulled by money, let them go that direction if it works.
And governments can provide incentives and push that along.
Right. Yeah. With government guidance, yeah.
Yeah. Don't let them loose. No.
Well, Joel, this is really, are there any, I was about to thank Joel because this is fantastic, but first I should ask, because we've been going, it's 8:43. Are there other questions, any topics you'd like to bring up?
Could you just tell us the name of that first book that you showed us?
That's called...
My daughter works at Fresno State, so I want to tell her.
Okay, it's called The Dreamt Land.
Okay.
And it's by Mark Arax, A-R-A-X,
okay, thanks.
Of Armenian descent.
Okay. Oh.
Well, Joel, I think by popular acclamation, this is not the end. It's just the beginning. Yeah, we're going up one level, so the next one is a certain.
That would be first.
Your preparation was very good. It was,
Yeah, it was. You just heard one of the best summaries ever
wow,
of climate change.
it was awesome.
Of climate change.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Glad to have the
Thanks,
opportunity
everyone.
to do it.
Remember, August 15th is our next one with Lester Pines on civil liberties in the times of crisis. So we'll send out messages too, and it'll be on the Temple Bethel website. So thanks once again, Joel. I think we could all unmute and thank Joel very much.
Joel.
Thank you.
Cold tooth, cold tooth.
Thank you.
And we have a recording, so we can, I guess I'll talk to Nicole about how we put this all together.
Mhm.
Oh, I
Thank you, Joel.
wanted to make one announcement. Nicole sent me an email message just before the beginning, just to tell you that the Bethel Lutheran Church is going to be holding a Preventing the Next Pandemic Urgency for a Planetary Health Approach. And this is by Jonathan Patz, who happens to be a member of Temple Bethel. He's also an authority on global health. So I will send that to the Torah study link. And it's on the Bethel website. So you can just go right to the Bethel Lutheran Church and see the website. And it's July 21st at 7 p.m. July 21st at 7 p.m. Preventing the Next Pandemic. So it's another
In person?
and we'll see if you can live up to Joel's.
It's going to be a Zoom, you mean?
Is it in person or Zoom?
It's a Zoom. It's a Zoom. I think it's a Zoom. Nicole, is it I think it's a Zoom.
So do we have to sign up ahead, or how does that work?
I haven't really read the message yet. I think if we go to the Bethel Lutheran Church website, there's a login link, so it must be Zoom. Yeah.
Okay,
I'll try to find out more and send out a message.
thank
All
you.
right. Sounds good.
Jonathan has high standards to live up to, Joel. So I say. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you,
Okay,
Joel.
good
Take a
night.
bow, take a bow.
And thank you, Linda. Thank you, Linda, for being the
Linda, you did
administrator.
a
Yeah, thank you, Linda.
You
Yeah.
bet. You bet. My pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.